Hi, Terry Rowland from T Rose Studios. Today I'm going to show you how to do paper piecing. Now I am using Carol Doak's Crazy Patch Heart. It's 6x6 finished. It's a great beginner paper piecing project. So the very first thing I'm going to do is look at the information that is on the pattern, and the pattern all comes on one page, and the link for the page will be in the information on this page. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out where my background fabric is. Number 1 is a background piece, number 12 is a background piece, number 9, number 10, and number 11 are background pieces. The rest of it will create the heart shape. And it's a crazy heart, so it's got lots of different pieces to make the heart. So this is a great opportunity to use some of your scraps. So I've selected different fabrics for each of the inside heart shapes, and they're all going to be different patterns of reds. This is going to be my background fabric. Now I've also gone down and looked at her cutting instructions, and she has basically told you what size of scraps you need to make this project. And I've tested out the actual sizes that she's cut, and it does work perfectly. So I need you to prepare for the class by cutting out all of your fabrics. And I've got mine all pre-cut, ready to go. And so this is my number 1 piece, my number 2, and I've stacked them in numerical order because that's how I'm going to use them, all the way down to my number 12. So I'm just going to set these aside. Now, what other information do you need before we get started? You need to change your needle size to a larger needle. A size 14 works really good for paper piecing. Now, we are actually sewing through the paper and need to remove it at the end of the project. So by sewing bigger holes, it's easier to rip the paper out. Now, the other thing that makes it easier to rip the paper out is to shorten your stitch length. So most machines are set at 2 or 2.2 stitch length. I want you to set yours at 1.5. Now that is pretty tight together. Again, if they're big holes and they're really tight together, it makes it easier for ripping the paper out after. So I'm going to change mine to the 1.5, and I've got a larger needle in mine already. Now you would normally match your thread to probably the red or the heart color because that's where most of the seams are going to be. I haven't. I'm going to sew with contrasting thread just so that you can see it a little better. So now what's the next step? What does all of the numbers on here mean? Well, it's numbered from 1 all the way out to 12. That's the order you're going to add your pieces. So number 1 is the first piece you're going to put onto your pattern. And then we're going to add number 2, and this is the sew line between 1 and 2. Once you've added 2, we're going to add 3, and this is where we will sew. This is the number 4 sew line. This is the number 5 sew line. This is the number 6. So we're going to work our way through the pattern until we get all the way to number 12. And when we're done, we will have a heart that looks something like this. This is the front, and this is our paper pattern that you're looking at right here. We will need to remove the paper when we're done, but we'll talk about that later. So let's get our pattern prepped. I'm just going to roughly cut it out outside that dotted line. That's our trim line at the very, very end. It doesn't have to be exact. All right, that's garbage, that's garbage. Now with paper piecing, let me just grab my garbage so it's a little closer. With paper piecing, you need a pattern a piece of paper for every one that you're going to do. So if you're doing 20 hearts, you need 20 pieces of paper. This is your cutting instructions, so you'll be doing that ahead of time. So the very first step I do is I pre-fold all of my stitching lines. So I'm going to fold on between the number 1 and 2, because that's a stitching line. Now, what are you going to use to fold with? I've got a really narrow ruler I like to use. You could use a Christmas card. Find a pretty one that you like. Makes it nice and easy. If you notice, I'm really pressing that. I want that crease in there. That's another thing that will make it easier later to rip the paper off, is if you've done a really good crease on it. So there's my 1, 2. I did that one, 3, 4. Here's 5. Here's 6. And if you notice, I'm only going to where it intersects the next one. I'm not folding the whole paper all the way across. Well, wasn't that lovely? There's another one. There's another one. I just like to have them pre-folded, and there's a couple of reasons for that, and I'll tell you those when we get to them. One more here. One more here. Okay. So now I'm pre-folded. All of mine are pre-folded. I'm ready to go. I'm going to grab my number 1 fabric, which is my background, and we're going to make sure that the wrong side of that fabric is to the back side of this paper. And I'm going to just set it here. Now we have to make sure that this fabric is behind that whole number 1 piece, knowing that we need to leave a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance along the edge. And when I flip this back, I can tell there's enough there for a 1/4 inch seam, and there's enough there for a 1/4 inch seam. So I have to get that fabric to stay there, so I'm ready for my next step. And I like to put 2 pins in it. Now if you notice, this is my stitching line. I'm going to try and get the heads of those pins as far away from that stitching line as I can. But I want that fabric to stay there also. So recap, we've got the wrong side of the fabric to the back of the paper, and now we're going to fold on our first stitch line, which is between number 1 and 2. All right, now we need to make a seam allowance, a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now you can just take a regular ruler, if you don't have the specialty rulers, and put your 1/4 inch line all along there and cut that. Or if you have an add a 1/4 ruler, which is made for paper piecing, it's a specialty ruler that has a little lip on it. So the ruler comes over and then it lips up and comes over. This little lip is a 1/4 of an inch. So if we take that and slide it over to the fold, it stops right on the fold. That gives us a perfect 1/4 of an inch. Now our seam allowance is ready for step 2, which is adding our number 2 fabric. So the very first thing we are going to do is we're going to put our next fabric pretty side up, so right side up. I'm going to pick up my pattern and set it on here. Now, because I've pre-folded it, I actually can see the lines, and I can see through this paper a little bit. This is the piece that needs to be covered with that red fabric. Again, I'm going to just sneak a peek and just make sure that there's fabric behind there, and there's plenty of fabric behind there. So I'm happy with that. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to flip this back, and we're going to sew on this line between number 1 and 2. Now I'm going to extend that line into the seam allowance because I want the fabric in the seam allowance to be sewn. I don't want two pieces of fabric just flapping there. So I'm going to just pull it over to my machine and I'm going to sew through the paper, starting on the edge of the seam line, and I'm going to stop one stitch past this line. So I've sewn here, I've come all the way down, I went one stitch past this intersection. Now I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to finger press. Basically just making sure that that's got a good press and it's pushed over all the way. It doesn't have a little fold here because that will distort your image. Little finger press with your fingernail is all you need. There are other tools you can use. You can get a wooden iron and that can press it over really nicely. You can get a steam or a little wooden roller. These are used really well for paper piecing because not everybody has power for an iron at their station. I like a little mini iron. I have a little mini iron station right next to me. I could press this with my iron. But finger pressing is all you really need. All right, so now I can actually take these pins out. We don't need them anymore because those two pieces are attached to my fabric. So I'm going to flip it back. Let's get rid of those long pieces. Now we've got number 1 and number 2 attached. Our next fabric we need to add is number 3. So we want to fold on the stitching line and we need to trim this. So I'm going to use my add a quarter ruler. I'm going to slide it over until it hits that fold, and then I am going to trim my seam allowance. Now I'm ready to find my number 3 fabric, which is next in my stack. I'm going to put it pretty side up. I will pull my my next seam and place it on top of here. Again, I can see that this is the fabric that I'm adding, the number 3 fabric. And I can see I've got fabric here. I can see I've got fabric there. I'm happy with that. I'm going to sew it. I'm just going to bring it over, flip the paper down. I am going to start right here, and I'm going to sew all the way through to there. No back stitching, just regular sewing all the way through. Get to the end, I'm just going to cut my thread. So as you can see, I've sewn one stitch past all the way through to the outside of the seam allowance on the outside. I'm going to flip it over, give it a little tug. I'm going to finger press it, nice and crisp. I'm going to flip it back, and we've got number 1, 2, and 3 attached. This is our next seam line between this unit and number 4, so we're going to press there, and we're going to trim our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to grab my number 4 fabric. I've put it right side up. I'm going to pick this unit up and place it on top. Now another thing that I do, if you notice, I've left just a little bit of the fabric that I am adding extended about a thread width past. I do that on purpose because when I rotate this and bring it over to my sewing machine, I can still see that I've got that 1 stitch past. I'm going to flip my paper back, and when I slide it under, I know I'm not going to be ripping because that seam hasn't shifted on me. I'm going to start 1 stitch past that intersection, and I'm going to sew all the way through to the outside edge and cut my thread. All right, so I started one stitch past here. I've gone all the way through and I've stitched through the outside edge. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to finger press again. Then I'm going to flip it back. I've got number 1, 2, 3, and 4 attached. Our number 5's way over here, so this is the one we want to fold on. Now if you've noticed, it's kind of pulling up a little bit because I went that one stitch past. All you have to do is a little tug. Here it's pulling because I went to the outside, but give it a little tug. It will release. The stitches are still there, but it's released the paper. Now I'm prepared to cut the seam allowance for our number 5 seam. I'm going to grab my number 5 fabric. I'm going to place it on the table, right side up. I'm going to pick this unit up and place it on top here. Now this is the piece that we need fabric behind. I can see there's fabric here, and the fabric comes all the way out to here, and it comes all the way out to here. So we've got lots of fabric. Again, I'm going to have it extend past just that little bit. I'm going to push it over towards my machine. Then I'm going to open up the paper and slide it under the machine and stitch through the seam allowance along that line all the way to the next intersection and go one stitch past and cut the thread. So, oh, I was a little off on that line. It's not going to make a big difference on here. I guess I can't sew straight. It'll be fine. I'm going to flip it. I am going to finger press. Then I'm going to open it and decide this is my net. We just added 5. We're going to add number 6, so we're going to fold on the seam line between 5 and 6. I'm going to throw my ruler on there, cut my seam allowance, and find my number 6 fabric, place it in front of me right side up, pick up my unit, set it on top. Now, this is the piece that we're adding, but we have to make sure that we've got fabric behind there. We're good. And I need fabric all the way over to about there, and we're good. So I'm happy with that. I've got that little bit of fabric pushing out underneath, just that ever so slightly, so I can see that it's still there. Sometimes if you're picking it up, it gets turned a little bit, and when you sew the seam, there's no fabric there. And that means you've got to rip. And I really detest ripping. So that's why I leave that little bit of the fabric we're adding sticking out so that I can see that I've got the fabric still where it's supposed to be. I'll slide it over, I'll open it up, and I'll start sewing through the outside. Edge all the way to the next intersection, go one stitch past, and cut the thread. Now I'm going to finger press. I'm going to flip it open. Now I'm going to rotate it because our next seam is this one all the way through here. So this is our number 7 piece we're adding. We're going to fold on the seam line. Again, we need to do that little tuck and a little tuck there and do our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Find our number 7 fabric, which is the next one on our pile. It's really handy when you have them pre-cut like that. I'm going to pick this unit up and I'm going to set it on top here. I can see I've got enough fabric all the way along here. Yep, my fabric goes here. I've got it extended just that ever so slightly. I've pushed it over closer to my machine. I'm opening my paper, and I'm going to sew from just on that side of that intersection all the way through. Cut my thread. So I've sewn this seam just one stitch past all the way down the number 7 seam line and out to the outside edge. I'll flip it over. I will press it, and then I'll flip it back and figure out what's our next seam. Our next seam is between 7 and 8. So I'm going to fold on that line. I'll just show you how I do it with just a regular ruler. I'm lining up my 1/4 inch line here, and I'm going to trim my seam allowance. I'm going to grab my number 8 fabric and put it on the table in front of me, right side up. And this is the number 8 fabric that we're going to be adding. Again, I'm going to extend that piece I just added ever so slightly so I can see it all the way along there. I'm going to slide it over towards my machine, and I'm going to open my paper up, and I'm going to sew from this point all the way through to this intersection. Go 1 stitch over. And cut the thread and finger press. All right, now our next one is a number 9 piece. So this is the number 9 stitching line. So we're going to fold on that. I'm going to take my ruler. I'm going to place that 1/4 inch line all the way along there. And we're going to cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now our number 9 fabric is a background fabric because we've got it circled. So I've got my background fabric with the right side up, and I'm going to place this right in the center because this is our corner. Now I want to make sure I've got fabric all the way out to the outside seam allowance, and when I flip this up I can just see that it fits. I'm happy with that. But if you've noticed, I left that little thread of the bottom fabric sticking out so I know that it doesn't sneak over on me and going to get out of place. I'm going to pull this open, and I'm going to go from the outside edge of the seam allowance all the way around this piece, all the way to the outside edge of the seam allowance again on the other side. And I'll just show you that. So I started out here, I sewed on that number 9 seam line, and I went all the way to the outside edge. So now I'm going to flip it up, and I'm going to press it, finger press it. Now I know that my line doesn't go all the way out to that edge, so that's why you see a little bit of the paper showing here. That's still within the seam allowance. Okay, it's coming along. Number 10 is way over here, so let's flip it so that I can actually work with it. We're going to fold on the number 10 line, but because I went through the outside edge, I have to just pull back just a little bit on that, and we will fold it on that fold line that we did at the very beginning. You'll find by pre-folding it, it's much easier as you're constructing this block. I'm going to line up my 1/4 inch line on my ruler, and I'm going to do my seam allowance. Now we're using another background piece because we circled it, and we're going to pick this unit up and set it on top of here. Again, I'm going to do a sneak peek right on this very corner because that's where the fabric has to come out to, and I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to slide it over here. I can still see that hint of the background fabric sticking out, and I'm going to sew through the seam allowance all the way around the outside, and I'm going to sew through the seam allowance on the outside and the other side. So I started right on the outside edge of the pattern, past this seam allowance here, all the way through the number 10 stitched line, all the way out to the outside edge. So now we'll flip it over. We'll do a nice press. I've got a little white sticking out, but I think I've got a little extra white there, which I do. I've got another 1/4 of an inch, so we're good there. And we're going to look for the number 11. 11's way up in this corner. We're going to fold on that line, and we're going to trim the 1/4 of an inch. So there's just a sliver there. I'm going to take my number 10 fabric, which again is a background fabric, and we're going to place it on there, leaving that little bit of that background showing so I know that it's not twisting on me. I'm going to open that, and I'm going to sew from the outside all the way through the number 11 seam line, all the way through to the outside edge again. Flip it over, press one more piece, number 12, and this one I know I've got to pull the paper back. I'm going to press it, or I'm going to fold that number 12 piece back. I'm going to trim my 1/4 inch. I'm going to take my number 12 fabric, which is the last one, and I'm going to place it in behind. Again, I'm going to check to make sure there's fabric there. Ooh, that's a little tight. I'm just going to slide it ever so slightly. I'm going to check again. I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to slide it over towards my machine, open it up, place my needle on the outside edge, so through the number 12 seam, all the way to the outside edge again. So I started on the outside edge, I sewed through the number 12, all the way to the outside edge. I'm going to finger press that. Now this is where I would go and press it at a pressing station. So I'm just going to clean off a little spot. I'm going to give this a really good press just to make sure everything's where it needs to be. All right, so that's what it looks like right now. So let's see what it's going to look like when we trim it. Now, when I go to trim a pattern, I always measure from the inside edge of the actual pattern out a 1/4 of an inch. I do a lot of playing with sizes of patterns, so I'll reduce them or I'll enlarge them. When I do that, my outside seam allowance is not generally true. So I always measure from that inside line out a 1/4 of an inch. So I've got my ruler lined up on there, and I'm going to trim all four sides. 1/4 inch, trim, 1/4 inch, trim, and lining up my 1/4 inch and trim. Okay, let's see what it looks like on this side now. There we go. We have got our little mug rug done. Now, I'm probably not making mug rugs. I could just quilt this and add a green binding to it, and it would be a lovely little mug rug. I'm going to make hot pads out of mine, or pot holders, I guess you want to call it. So I'm going to add a trim around it, a 1.5 to 2 inch framework around mine, so that it'll be big enough to actually have as a pot holder. So that's your choice, whether you want to make a little mug rug to go as a little gift for somebody. If you want to make a little bit of a pot holder, you'll need just a little bit more fabric to add the border around it. and then we'll need binding and all of that later. All right, so once you've gotten it to this point, we've got the paper still on it. So we can't go on to the quilting end of it until we remove the paper. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about removing the paper. Now some people will take and they will pull on it just to loosen some of the seams. You've got to be a little bit gentle with it, but we need to have somewhere to start. So once you've loosened some of the seams, I like to put my thumbnail on a seam so that I'm not pulling on the seams too bad. Sometimes you can fold it back. We've already done that, so that's loosened it. But once you get one out, you can see how easy it is to go on to the next one. It's always harder where you don't have the edge where you've got one of the pieces out. Some people like to have tweezers to get into these little corners when they kind of get a little bit stubborn. This one's out, so we're going to flip up. I'm going to hold onto the seam to just give it a little bit of a support. Again, I'm holding onto that seam. Really doesn't take too long once you get going on it, but be a little gentle on those seams. If you wouldn't have shortened your seam, the stitch length, you would have probably been popping a couple of those seams. I've seen that happen in paper piece projects. So you have to make sure that every time that you start your project, that you get that seam shortened up so that it's not going to be pulling out when you get to this stage. Now, you also want to make sure that you check to make sure your fabric's in the right place, because there's nothing worse than ripping a seam that has got such a short stitch length. There, I'm just about done. A couple more little pieces. I'm just working my way around the project. I find paper piecing very, I love it. I love it. I do so much of it. It just comes second nature to me. The more you do, the better you'll get at it, and the more confident you'll get. If you do your checkpoints and make sure that you've always got fabric in behind your piece, you never have to rip, which is lovely. Okay. I need to find a couple of little tweezers just to get rid of a couple of those little corners, but other than that, it's been totally ripped out and it's ready to start to quilt and get ready for the binding. Now, when you get your little heart done, we need you to send a picture in, and Teresa's going to have a spot for you to send them. We've got a door prize or a prize for somebody that has completed one of these projects this weekend. So I hope that you'll make one, and we'll see you tomorrow. I'm going to talk about binding tomorrow.